Okay, 17th century social life, right? So we've been talking about, with every period of time, we've been talking about social distinctions through dress. And the 17th century is no different. However, in this period, there's a lot more historical evidence of the monarchies, right? The royal classes, and the upper echelons of society. So we will touch a little bit on what the regular folks will when we get to actual garments. We actually see garments, but talking about social life, we're kind of focused a little bit more on the aristocracy and the monarchies in this section. So, social life during the 17th century is no different than the Renaissance in the fact that social status was definitely depicted through dress in both obvious and subtle ways. So in the first part of this lecture, the first video, I talked about how even nobles of modest means, right? I know those two things don't go together, but nobles on the lower socioeconomic spectrum would spend all that they could, all that they had to keep up appearances. So, dress is still communicated in that way. And in a society in which the social classes are well defined, garments, clothing relating to dress is a visible symbol of your social status and rank. So that's why that keeping up appearances was really, really important. So in this section of the lecture, we're going to talk about the French court a little bit more in depth, specifically the social stratifications in the French court. We'll talk about the English aristocracy. We will talk about a little bit about the English Puritans and what they wore, and then we'll talk about the North American colonists, which, as I've stated in the first video, were just English Puritans that left England. So that's what we're going to talk about in this piece of the lecture. So on our timeline here of this century, we're going to talk about kind of what we've been talking about. We'll talk about fashion, textiles. We'll talk a little bit more about political conflict. So we talked about that. You got that in the first tab in historical perspective. Of course, we'll talk about some decorative arts. We'll talk about, we'll talk about adornments, and we'll actually go look at some garments, right? We will talk about for this social, life during the 17th century. We'll be talking a little bit more about religion because the Puritans played such a big role in this era. Even though the Catholic Church and Protestantism and Reformation played a part in the other eras, the Puritans did play a significant role. And the imagery that we see is a lot more pronounced. So we will also be talking about them. Okay, I had to do some adjustments to readjust some stuff. So I'll be looking down now instead of looking over there. I had to readjust it to click. So let's talk about the French court. We're going to talk about the French court because we talked about Versailles in the first piece, and the French palace was, as I said in the historical part, was the seat of all life in the court. So Paris was not the place to be. Versailles is actually about 45 minutes. It's about a 45-minute train ride on a contemporary train ride outside of Paris. It is a palace on acres. It has apartments and rooms and rooms and rooms, but everybody didn't live there. So there were people, the folks closest to the king lived in those spaces. So the royal family and their closest, not necessarily allies, but their closest courtiers. That's what they were called, courtiers. So people that helped them in the court. So their dressers and ladies in waiting, and their closest advisors all lived in apartments. And then the other noble people lived in houses in the village surrounding Versailles. And some of, like I said in the first part, the houses were great. And some of them were kind of squalid conditions, but you would never know by what they wore. So, those of really significant rank attended to the king. Again, I talked about the first piece, that being able to attend to the king was a high honor. being by his side was something that they loved to do. Interesting piece is with the French court was that, getting dressed in the morning consisted of, rubbing your face with a cloth, like just touching the pieces, right? I could use a bunch of colloquial language for what it entailed, but it was not a bath. It was not what we consider getting ready for the day. Also because water was contaminated, it was considered dangerous, that bathing really was rare. Bathing was rare because the water was contaminated. Versailles was very drafty. So getting in a bath could also cause you to be sick. So social life was interesting. That's why we see so many with a handkerchief, because it was perfume, because people did not smell good. Sounds like a labor, that's great. So clothing was one of the major items of expense for folks at court. So one writer of the period, Saint Simeon, wrote about spending about 800, we would say dollars, but at the time $800 for clothes for himself and his wife to just attend a wedding. So that's about $4,000 today. So that's a good amount of money to attend one wedding. So festivities were elaborate, and often in the French court they changed their clothing several times a day. In England, during this time, so the contemporary of the court of Versailles was the reign of Charles I, and it was, less impressive than Louis, but his son, Charles II, as we saw in the first part of the video, he brought the fire when he came back. He came back with all of the French finery. So the first half of the 17th century in England was, not as splashy and fancy. It was, pretty much rural, and aristocrats lived on country estates. But with Charles II coming back from France, he brought that French sensibility of the supreme monarch that everyone should do everything possible to be close to. And again, social life, of the upper class required them to spend more time at court. And that's when London society fashion began to evolve. Interestingly enough, English aristocratic finery usually was fabrics that came from France and, ding, 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 our good old friend Italy. So, right, remember all the Italian fabrics that we talked about in the Renaissance. And things were still coming along that Silk Road. So, but that trade through the Mediterranean made its way to France, then made its way to England. So those ancient Silk Roads were still producing garments. So the English Puritans really, they rejected the court of Charles II. They saw it as overly ostentatious, but also just as religious conservatives. That's the word I'm going to use. As religious conservatives, they believed that they needed to literally purify the Church of England. That's why they're called the Puritans. And there were distinctions in these two factions of the government. So kind of the Royalists and the Puritans. The Royalists actually were known as the Cavaliers. But in reality, the Puritans at this point in time still followed similar dress to those of the English court. Now, even though they followed similar dressing styles, their garments were often described as sad colored because if you look at the image here, everything is brown and gray and black and drab. Whereas when we looked at the pictures of the English court, everything was vibrant and exciting, and the English Puritans really were sedate in their method of dress, even though the style that they used was similar. The style, the silhouettes that they used were similar. Then when we get to the North American Puritans, really the Puritans that left, that we call the Pilgrims, that settled in New England, they do continue that trend of sad colored dressings. You have to keep in mind too that the early North American colonists had to bring a lot of the garments with them. When they got here, they were able to weave. After some time, because they brought sheep with them. They cultivated cotton as well. That took a little bit of time, but they brought sheep with them. So their early garments were either brought with them whole, or they were homespun wool garments from sheep that they actually tended to. So they kind of went backwards in the textile history that we've seen of buying cloth that's produced by someone else. So the Puritans also had that sad clothing. I talked about in the first part of the lecture. I talked about how there were some sumptuary laws because there were still some importation of goods from France, some goods from England, but they were so limited that they were seen as very ostentatious. And part of what the Puritans wanted to do was get themselves closer to God, right? So, some of the sumptuary laws included, types of weave for wools, and not having, striped silks, and, actually having finer garments was seen as being further away from God than you wanted to be. So, religious and secular leaders didn't always agree. More than often, they didn't approve of fancier garments. And it's interesting because the Puritans left England to avoid religious prosecution, and then they really didn't have much liberty when they got here, because they had such staunch religious conservative views that they were under a different type of pressure to conform, which was much different than in England. In England, they had more freedom because they were in a larger society, and when they got into such a closed society, they actually had less freedoms because they had very little freedom to be themselves. They had to conform. So that's where we're going to leave the social life during the 17th century, and the next part of the lecture that we get to, we're going to talk about fabric. We're going to talk about textile production in this period, and then we will look at some garments.